Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Is this mic working well? Virangana, can you hear me? So this is our first event for 2026. So I know we're halfway down January, but on behalf of the Museum Society, may I wish everyone a very happy new year, and we hope this year will progress well with good health, prosperity, and more importantly, peace for our world. On behalf of the chairman of the Prince of CSMVS, Mr. Cyrus Gazda, who has climbed up to Everest today, the Director General, Mr. Sabyasachi Mukherjee, who is at base camp. All the Himalayan Club members are having a good laugh, I think. Trustees of the CSMVS, staff of the CSMVS, the Executive Committee of the Museum Society, and myself, a very, very warm welcome to Dr. Henry Noltie. I have been in correspondence with him for a few years, thanks to an old museum connection, who you all know, Dr. Annie Buddle, who's addressed us on many, many occasions. I asked her about the Dapuri drawings once, and she said, "Oh, I know him." Of course, Buddle knows everyone. And she said, "I'll introduce you via email." And there was this long, protracted correspondence over the years, and I had almost given up that I'm never going to meet Mr. Noltie because he doesn't want to make this long trip out to India. But what did it was the climate. It's very, very cold where he lives, and it's been a bitter winter. So thank you so much for making this journey back to India, to your many, many old haunts. I know that between us we have lost lots of friends over the last 2 decades, and I'm referring to my dearest friend, one of my dearest, Pauline Rohatgi, who worked for many, many years at the India Office Library and Records. And she introduced me to a lot of subjects, including what you're going to hear about today, botanical drawings from India. So thank you very, very much. We are looking forward to your presentation this evening on Flora, Indica, Recovering Lost Stories of Indian Botanical Art. If you read about Dr. Noltie, you'll know and I was talking to the Ranibagh ladies earlier. I said, I don't think between all of us, we know 500,000 trees and plants. And I think you know them all. They're your old friends. So, a few words about Henry Noltie. For 30 years, he worked at the Royal Botanic Garden in Edinburgh as a taxonomist, curator, and historian. As a curator, he produced many exhibitions in the garden's Inverleith House Gallery. As a taxonomist, he specialized in the grasses, rushes, sedges of the Sino-Himalaya and wrote 2 volumes on the flora of Bhutan. During this work, he became interested in the history of the garden's rich collections of 500,000 Indian herbarium species related to botanical drawings made by Indian artists. This led to monographs on 3 of the major drawings collections made for the East India Company's surgeons, Robert Wright, Alexander Gibson, and Hugh Cleghorn. For 16 years, he was an honorary research associate of the Royal Botanic Gardens, Kew, and currently has a similar status at the Royal Botanic Garden, Edinburgh, and the Natural History Museum in London. We have quite a few botanists and professors who teach botany at leading institutions in Bombay, and I do hope that you'll be able to interact with them after the lecture. This particular talk is based on the exhibition, and when we corresponded, it was a related book yet to be released and shortly to come out in India but we are so fortunate that Rowley Publishers have brought copies of this book to this evening's event. And this exhibition was co-curated with Dr. Sita Reddy, and it's on show at the Royal Botanic Gardens Kew till April of 2026. The exhibition contains 52 drawings by Indian artists made for the East India Company patrons in northern India between 1790 and 1850. These are magical dates for anybody who understands that part of Indian history. One of the major lost stories has been to recover, where possible, the names of the artists who made this exquisite work, and I will not stand between the speaker and the audience this evening. So may I request Mrs. Shir Sagar, committee member, wife of the former chairman of the CSMVS, Mr. Eknath Shir Sagar, to present a small memento on behalf of all of us here this evening to Professor Henry Noltie. I would also like to add here one more thing. We cannot have these events without the support of members and friends like all of you. And I'm really pleased that this event is supported by none other than Mrs. Meenal Eknath Shir Sagar. Thank you very, very much on behalf of all of us, Meenal, for doing this. Thank you. And now we're looking forward to a lot of botany.
Thank you, Feroza, for those very kind words. I can't tell you how much pleasure it gives me to be here in Bombay, my favourite Indian city. It was a kind of introduction by introduction by archives. Feroza mentioned the Dapuri drawings, which I wrote in 2000, I started to research in 2000, and I spent a month during the monsoon in Elphinstone College over there, which was really quite something. And then I went to Pune to see the remains of the Dapuri garden, which is now an irrigation workshop. So without more ado, the talk is about an exhibition, as we've heard, that I've recently curated with Dr. Sita Reddy, a colleague based between Washington and Hyderabad, which opened at Kew in October and runs until April. It consists of 52 from Kew's collection of more than 7,000 Indian drawings made for British patrons between 1790 and 1850. And represents the most recent phase of work that I started in 1998 in the Edinburgh Botanic Garden, where I spent nearly all my career. But to start with the question, why do Kew and Edinburgh have these precious but little-known collections? There's a huge difference in the origin between the National Botanic Gardens of England and Scotland. Edinburgh was founded in 1670, the time of Shivaji, primarily as an establishment for teaching medical students, and it was administered jointly by the British Crown and the Town Council of Edinburgh, which ran the city's then century-old university. This continued up till the mid-20th century, when all medical students had to study botany. A particularly important period was the late 18th century, when Edinburgh was the preeminent establishment in Europe for the teaching of medicine. From it, many graduates went out to the incipient empire, first to the west, to the Caribbean and American colonies, and then to the east, particularly India, where medics made fundamental contributions to the study and documentation of plant diversity, among many other fields of knowledge. In India, dried plant specimens were backed up with drawings made by skilled Indian artists, some of which ended up back in Edinburgh. By contrast, Kew, and for almost its first century, was a private royal enterprise, a 9-acre botanic garden started by Augusta, Princess of Wales, in 1759, within one of two large royal parks that were combined in 1802, but transferred to the British government only in 1840. From then on, Kew's remit, initially under Sir William Hooker, followed by his son Joseph, was both scientific and explicitly imperialistic in ethos. The scientific element was part of the international effort to document the whole of plant biodiversity, work essential to understanding evolutionary and biogeographic processes, the fundamental basis for the documentation of potential change due to the climate crisis, and for conservation programs. While it's become fashionable to concentrate on economic aspects and exploitative aspects of colonialism, it must never be forgotten that the number of species of plants developed commercially, things like opium, tea, indigo, represent only a tiny fraction of plant biodiversity. In the 19th century, Kew's primary link was with the British government, with no formal link to an academic institution, whilst also acting as a focus for a worldwide network of botanic gardens in the colonies. So Kew's collection of Indian drawings reflects this history. Some were originally in William Hooker's private collection, which was purchased for the nation following his death in 1865. But more came with the British government, including ones commissioned by the employees of the East India Company at the Botanic Gardens of Calcutta and Saharanpur. From 1800, the company had its own library and museum at its headquarters of Leadenhall Street, where the Lloyd's building now is in the City of London, in which these drawings were deposited. But after 1858, when the British government took over the administration of India, the museum became an embarrassment. It was finally abolished in 1879, when its botanical material, including the drawings, were transferred to Kew. But also at Kew are collections of drawings made by private individuals, donated by the descendants of the commissioners, or occasionally purchased. So what happened when such collections arrived at Kew? As I mentioned, one of its main roles since 1840 has been a centre for taxonomic research. Traditionally, this has been, and to a large extent still is, based on the study of dried specimens arranged in a herbarium. Kew's worldwide one now has about 7 million specimens. There have always been tensions, indeed opposing views, about the value of illustration in the study of botany. And the one that's come to prevail amongst taxonomists is, however, the opposite of the popular one. It's the herbarium specimen, not the illustration, that tells 1,000 words. This primacy has only increased in recent years, when DNA can now be extracted from dried specimens, which has revolutionised classification that could previously only be based on the appearance of morphological characters, such as those recorded, no matter how accurately, by botanical artists. So on arrival at Kew, drawings from a collection were sorted taxonomically, largely ignoring their artistry, their history and geography. They were stuck onto backing sheets so that they could be filed in the same order as the herbarium specimens by family, genus and species. The drawings weren't listed or numbered, and if more than one species was depicted on a sheet, then it was cut up so that the parts could be mounted separately and filed. The backing sheets are of poor quality paper and of 2 standard sizes, which meant that drawings often had to be trimmed or folded to fit them. The sheets are the same. Some of the sheets, there are 2 sizes of sheets. Some the same size as the herbarium specimens, about A3, and these were kept in the herbarium. The larger folio-sized ones were kept in the rare book room in the library. So in the late 1990s, I went through the whole of the similar collection at Edinburgh, removed the pre-1850 Indian drawings and regrouped them into their original collections by commissioner, catalogued them and undertook projects on the most important 3. First one was the Dapuri one, assembled by Alexander Gibson here in the Bombay Presidency Then I moved on to 2 from the Madras Presidency, commissioned by Robert White and Hugh Cleghorn, the first forest conservator. Gibson was the first forest conservator for Bombay. Cleghorn was the first conservator for Madras. And I realised that one day someone ought to do the same thing with the Kew collection, never suspecting it might end up being me. But in 2018, William Dalrymple approached me for help with the botanical section of an exhibition called Forgotten Masters on Indian painting for the British, which was to open at the Wallace Collection in London in November 2019. He gave me one day to find some suitable drawings at Kew, but having known the collection at least in general terms for 30 years, I was able to make a rough stab, if not necessarily the best one. But I realised that much more needed to be done. So over the next 3 years, I went through the whole collection, as I'd done at Edinburgh. I'd been an honorary research associate at Kew since 2009 and could undertake the work during visits to Kew from Edinburgh on a voluntary basis. But it was only possible because I then had full access to the herbarium and library collections. During long weekdays and weekends, I was able to go through 200,000 drawings housed between the herbarium and the rare book room of the library, reassembled 15 collections and catalogued more than 5,000 drawings, giving them accession numbers for the first time. The cataloguing included in identifying the species depicted with their current names, finding which ones had been published, and making links between the drawings and related herbarium specimens. Perhaps the most important aspect of this was working out which drawings had been used in the description of new species, what is called type material. This is important because it's this that makes the Indian artists significant, if unacknowledged, contributors to the global taxonomic project. It also included reconnecting parts of drawings that had been cut up by the taxonomists, who viewed them merely as proxy specimens. I entered the information into 15 spreadsheets, which I gave to the Kew for use by the library and the illustrations team. But sadly, new rules are now in place so that I'm no longer allowed into the rare book room and have only the same access as a member of the general public, which also means only being allowed to see 12 drawings at a time. So no opening up of the collection, research, or indeed the exhibition itself would be possible under this new regime. So how did the exhibition come about? Due to the way the drawings were used by taxonomists, the chopping up, the backing sheets, but also the soot-laden London atmosphere, meant that all of them required the attentions of paper conservators. As a matter of priority, they also all need to be digitised so they can be studied by people who can't visit Kew. I wanted the conservation and digitisation to be started as a matter of urgency, and enlisted the help of Gina Fullerlove, seen on the right in the orange, who had recently retired as the head of publications at Kew and was looking for an opportunity to work on the newly recovered Indian drawings. And she was a wonderful link with Kew. But the powers that be decided that these were not the priorities and that instead an exhibition should come first, which might raise awareness of the collection with the hope of attracting external funding for conservation and digitisation. As co-curator, Sita on the left was the ideal colleague. She'd recently edited a volume devoted to Indian botanical art for Marg, published here in Mumbai. And in 2021, she'd written the foreword to a book on the Kew collection, also published by Rowley, written by Martin Ricks, but based largely on my work. More significantly, Sita and I had collaborated on an exhibition of drawings from the Cleghorn collection in Edinburgh that in 2019 travelled to India in the form of facsimiles. These were very high quality giclée prints that were printed in India from the files we sent and framed here. This started off in Chennai at the Dakshina Chitra Museum and then went to Hyderabad to the Goethe Zentrum and the State Archaeological Museum in Hyderabad. Kew has a modern art gallery with 6 very unequally sized spaces and an exhibition team who often pair a contemporary art exhibition with an archival one. The Singh twins are artist sisters of Sikh heritage from Liverpool, whose work explores themes of colonialism and consumerism, and they'd already been invited to make an exhibition for the autumn of 2025. Their work is in a style that they call past modern. It's deeply researched, very colourful, pattern-rich, and often symmetrical, printed on translucent fabric and displayed in light boxes. The work incorporates images painted by hand using miniature technique, but also a wide range of popular printed imagery. And being Indian in theme, our exhibition was seen as a suitable pairing. So I spent a day with them in the Kew Library, showing them the drawings so that some of them could be incorporated into their new show for the work. The sponsor, who paid part of the cost of the building of the gallery, had a perpetual claim to the second largest space to display items from her private collection of contemporary botanical art, which left 4 remaining smaller peripheral galleries in which Sita and I could show a tiny selection of some of Kew's greatest treasures. The major problem, of course, was the sheer embarrassment of riches. How do you choose a representative selection from more than 7,000 drawings? For this, having a colleague with similar tastes and ideas, but a complementary Indian and American academic and cultural background, was of immense value. The exhibition couldn't have happened without Sita's help. One of our major aims was to foreground the skill of the Indian artists and their neglected contribution to science. At the same time, to tell some of the many stories encoded within what are palimpsests. The drawings are covered in notes written by generations of Kew staff, occasionally by the artist or commissioner. They cross perceived divides, such as East-West, art-science, and artworks versus artifacts. Sita had the idea of 3 narrative arcs: the lives of the artists, the lives of the collection, with an exhibition afterlife beyond Kew. And what emerged was a title, Flora, Indica, Recovering the Lost Histories of Indian Botanical Art, and a theme for each of our 4 galleries. Limitations of space sadly meant excluding any drawings from South or West India, concentrating rather on the North, which in any case is the part that Kew's is richest in. So in May 2024, Sita travelled to Kew from Hyderabad for 3 weeks, and we got down to selecting the drawings by whizzing through the whole collection on a computer screen as thumbnail images. The aim was to balance visual impact with revealing stories. We steered away from plants such as medicines and spices, which have rather been done to death, not least in previous Kew exhibitions. We wanted to show that all plants are of interest and importance, not just those that happen to be useful to man. And we also wanted to give more nuanced stories than so many decolonising narratives that can so often be reductive. Heaven alone knows if we've succeeded in coming up with anything satisfactory. The only advantage we have is that none of the visitors will know what we had to miss out. Another essential aspect was to show the interlinked nature of the different collections housed at Kew. The herbarium specimens, the illustrations, archival letters and printed books, together with ethnobotanical artefacts in the Museum of Economic Botany. This related material had to be very carefully chosen because only 2 small display cases were available, but in these we were able to give at least a glimpse of the diversity of the collections and their interconnectedness. So with great difficulty we selected 62 works, which we measured to fit the available space. The intention was for a dense hang to stand up to the richly coloured work of the Singh twins, which we knew was to be set against dark indigo walls. Our galleries are the first to be entered from daylight, so we had to lead up to the central Singh space by means of increasingly strong colours on the walls of the 4 galleries, lit at 50 lux illumination. The exhibition team later made us cut the number of drawings on the grounds that the paper conservators wouldn't be able to process so many, and that having so many drawings would risk being visually chaotic. When we protested, we were told that our work was a collaboration, but that in such matters Q had the final say. So we had to remove 10 drawings, leaving the final 52, though the whole original selection is included in the book. So to give you a taste of the exhibition, I've chosen 5 or 6 drawings from each of the 4 galleries. So this is the first gallery. To foreground the creators of the work, this focuses on the work of the Indian artists whose names we know. Traditionally, much Indian art, including most of the botanical drawings, is unsigned and therefore has been regarded as anonymous. The artists, while relatively well paid, left no written records, so any knowledge of them comes almost entirely through information vouchsafed by their patrons. Discovering such information has been a laborious process, but it has been possible in Gallery 1 to show a varied range of work by 8 named artists, with works by a further 6 in the other galleries, and in the catalogue at least sketchy details are given for a total of 21 named artists. This sort of naturalistic work was alien to Indian artists of whatever school or background, but with traditional and finely honed skills in draftsmanship, and on being shown Western botanical drawings as models, the artists were able to fulfil their commissioner's desire for scientific accuracy, whilst at the same time expressing their own flair for design when it came to placement on the page. One of the patrons who wrote the artist's name on many drawings was a Scottish surgeon called Adam Freer, though this has only recently become known as a result of research that I'll return to. But in Bengal between 1808 and 1810, he employed a team of 5 Hindu, 2 Muslim artists. The former had the surname Lal, a family of painters based in Patna. And this chickpea is by Sam Lal, whose work is particularly decorative and executed in a more transparent watercolour than the more usual, thicker body colour. One of the greatest of all Indian botanical artists was called Gaurachand. He too may have had a Patna background and was working in the Calcutta Botanic Garden by 1813, when this drawing was made for its then acting director, Henry Colebrook, the great Sanskrit scholar. Although of an upper caste, Gaurachand defied its ban on crossing the Black Water, when in 1826 he accompanied Colebrook's successor, Nathaniel Wallich, on an expedition to Burma, where he unfortunately succumbed to fever. This drawing shows a climbing legume called Mucuna monosperma, and is a good example of the sort of elegant layout combined with exquisite miniature detail, such as can be seen in the fruit at the top left. The name of Vishnu Prasad first appears in 1805, when he drew birds and animals in the Governor-General's menagerie at Barrackpore. After being employed by Francis Buchanan as one of 2 artists on a 7-year survey of Bengal, he joined the Calcutta Botanic Garden staff, where he must have learned from Gaurachand, whom he rapidly equalled or even excelled. And on Gaurachand's death, he became the garden's head painter until his own death in 1835. His drawing of Impatiens glandulifera is an interesting example of showing how drawings were treated by taxonomists if more than one species was shown on a sheet. On the left-hand side, Joseph Hooker cut the sheet in two and even signed his act of vandalism on each side of the break. The main part, the big drawing, I found in the folio drawings in the rare book room. The smaller part, showing a less imposing species, I found many months later in the herbarium cupboard of dried Impatiens specimens. But as part of the work for the exhibition, the Kew paper conservators have made a wonderful job of putting Humpty Dumpty back together again to restore the artist's original intention. I should add that this is an example of reverse colonization, because the Himalayan balsam is now an invasive species in Britain and dominates riverbanks. The third of the greatest Calcutta artists was Lakshman Singh, and slightly more is known about him than of the other artists. He had an extraordinarily long career from 1827, when he was described as a youth, with his last dated drawing from 1863. He drew not only plants but birds, animals, and portraits of people in a late Mughal style. And while Vishnu Prasad and Gaurachand probably came from artistic backgrounds in Patna, Lakshman seems to have been different. From his name and an escapade when he ran off to the Himalayan state of Terry, it's possible that he came from that area, which is known for the Pahari school of miniature painting. He must, however, have benefited greatly from Vishnu Prasad's teaching. This is a Himalayan plant, Filipendula vestita, one of Lakshman's earliest works. But as a reminder that many drawings still remain anonymous and that much remains to be discovered, we had to include in the Artists' Gallery a crinum from the collection of Claude Martin, made in Lucknow in the 1790s. Martin was a soldier who deserted the French East India Company and ended up working for the English one and for the Nawab of Awadh. He had wide interest in the arts and sciences and employed Indian artists to make drawings of birds and plants, but regrettably he neglected to record any of their names. So the second gallery, the colours warming up, is devoted to the Calcutta Botanic Garden, which was founded in 1787 by a remarkably enlightened Scottish soldier called Colonel Robert Kidd, in part to experiment with plants of potential economic value, but also with ones useful for the alleviation of famine, which had then recently ravaged Bengal. Its first paid superintendent in 1793 was the Scottish surgeon William Roxburgh, who had been undertaking similar experimental botanical work in southern India, where he employed artists, probably originally textile painters, to record the plants he was collecting and describing. He took his head painter with him to Calcutta, where he recruited 4 more, including Gaurachand. But like Claude Martin, Roxburgh failed to record the names of any of his artists, even when their work was published. By 1813, when he left India, Roxburgh had commissioned drawings of about 2,500 Indian species, and for each drawing a copy was made. One was sent back to the company's library in London, the other was kept to himself. The company's set's now at Kew, and his own remains in the Botanic Garden in Kolkata. But because many of the drawings were made in South India, they largely had to be excluded from the exhibition. But because they were the foundation of the garden's collection, we had to include one. And from its sophistication, this superb one of the Singara nut or water chestnut was certainly made by one of the artists recruited in Bengal. Roxburgh and his successors used the garden as a base for exploring the plants of India and Southeast Asia. And while some of this was economically driven, such as seeking and translocating spice plants, the surgeon botanists played a double act. With the thirst to satisfy their own scientific recording of all botanical biodiversity, they also had to have an eye to the company, whose interest was revenue generation or saving money by finding indigenous substitutes, especially for medicines. Botany wasn't the only biological science of interest to the company, and to improve the blood stock of Indian horses, they employed a vet called William Moorcroft. He was also a keen botanist, and on an excursion to the Trans-Himalaya, he found this umbelliferous plant called Prangos pabularia, which he hoped might become a useful fodder crop for arid regions. This didn't work out, but from the dried specimen sent back as a bundle of hay to Calcutta, Gorakchand did his best to make this drawing, including the superb detail of the massive root, which survived the journey rather better than the green above ground parts. Roxburgh's successor as a superintendent was Nathaniel Wallach, who was unique amongst company employees in being Danish and Jewish. He continued Roxburgh's work of botanical exploration, but also the employment of a team of botanical artists, and through a network of collectors and correspondents, British, Indian and Anglo-Indian, he amassed a huge herbarium which he took to England between 1828 and 1832, along with 1,200 drawings that had been made for him by the garden's artists. And when he was in London, he published almost 300 of these as superb hand-coloured lithographs, on which he gave the head painter's name, which is how he might know who did which drawings, the Plantae Asiaticae rariores. Wallach took his artists on excursions to Nepal in 1820, and as we've seen in Burma in 1826, and it was in a temple garden in Burma that he was shown this spectacular scarlet-flowered leguminous tree, which he named for the Governor-General's wife as Amherstia nobilis, which I was thrilled to see yesterday in flower in the Rani Bagh here. Another of Wallach's finds in Burma was this plant, a spiny palm with edible fruit, which was named after Wallach in Germany as Salacca wallachiana. This drawing, also by Vishnu Prasad, represents another example of fragmentation, this time not from the taxonomist's scalpel, but the result of folding and subsequent tearing. The lower part I found placed correctly in a folder of palm drawings in the rare book room. The missing upper section I eventually found in a cover of unidentified ferns, but it was only by having access to the collections that it's possible to make such reconnections. In 1849, several of the Calcutta garden artists were lent to John Ferguson Cathcart, a judge who, while convalescing in Darjeeling, embarked on a project to illustrate the local flora. Unique amongst the Kew collections, a large proportion of these Cathcart drawings bear annotations by the artists. They're in pencil, as you see on the right, in a difficult Bengali script, but a project has begun to translate them, which shows them to be the artist's name and the date and place of the plant's collection. And this stunning drawing of Begonias sycamensis is a later example, 20 years later, by Lakshman Singh from that earlier Filipendula we saw. So the third gallery is devoted to the Saharanpur garden, and in it you can see one of the display cases which combines a printed book on the left, Royal's illustrations of the botany of the Himalayan mountains, an original drawing from that, from which the lithograph was made, then a herbarium specimen of the same plant, and then on the right, Pinus gerardiana, the source of the chilgoza nuts, and that drawing is absolutely unique. It's got, when the drawing was first made, they hadn't seen the cone, and so the cone was added on a flap which you can lift up and down. But the subject of the gallery, the Saharanpur garden, it was an old garden that belonged to the Rohilla chieftain Zabita Khan in Saharanpur, which the company took over in 1817 to develop as a second botanic garden under another Edinburgh-trained surgeon called George Govan. It's 100 miles north of Delhi, so close to the Himalayas. and they had also an outstation in the foothills at Missouri. So it was an ideal base for exploring the alpine regions and in which to grow less tropical plants than thrived in steamy Calcutta. Govan had to pay a local artist out of his own pocket, so the drawings were his own property. But in 1828, his successor John Forbes Royal benefited from Wallace's London leave, as the Calcutta artists were transferred to Saharanpur, where they made hundreds of drawings for him and his successor. And unlike Govan's, these were company property, though in the end both the Govan and the Saharanpur collections have ended up at Kew. Royal was interested in medicinal plants, and ones mentioned in classical literature, both European and Indian, things like the spikenard, Nardostachys. The British were obsessed with bowels, and when spending large amounts on medicinal rhubarb with a purgative root, which came mainly from China. So Royal decided to investigate various species of rhubarb native to British Himalayan territory, to see if they might be equally effective and therefore save money on imports. This is Rheum webianum, one of the species he looked at. The Calcutta artists were still in Saharanpur when Hugh Falconer took over from Royal, but they had to return to Calcutta in 1832, and it wasn't until 1838 that Falconer was again able to employ artists. These later ones sadly are anonymous, but they were probably locally recruited, and they painted in a much bolder style than the Calcutta artists, as can be seen in this spectacular poppy. Here's another example of what, from an art historical point of view, is bad treatment. The drawing had been trimmed to fit a predetermined size of backing sheet, so that the petal detail had to be cut around and folded over. Fortunately, it didn't break off in this case. This poppy, Papava bracteatum, isn't native to India. It only occurs from Turkey as far east as Iran. But it's an example of the plant exchanges that by this date were going on through an international network of botanic gardens, facilitated by Royal, who was by now back in London, acting as botanical advisor and distribution agent for the East India Company. George Govan, the founder of Saharanpur, was only there for 4 years before returning to Scotland, where he married, and the couple returned to India, where he was posted to a geological survey of the Himalayas, and the couple based themselves in Shimla. His wife, Mary Maitland, was interested in botany, and the couple continued to add to George's collection made at Saharanpur much earlier. Although Mary was a competent artist and made a few drawings for the collection, despite what it says on the printed label, top right, which was put on by Proud Sons when they gave the collection to Kew in 1904. It says that the drawings were made by Mary Govan herself, but in fact the majority of the drawings are not by her. It can sometimes be difficult to say if a drawing is in a Western or an Indian hand, but ones like this exquisite study of the perfume-producing vetiver grass is unquestionably Indian. The Devanagari script, which gives the place and date of collection in the bottom. Oh no, it's been chopped off on this slide. But some of them have Devanagari script, which can only have been written by the artist, who, if he was recruited in Simla, was probably of the Pahari school, like Lakshman Singh. Copying has always been a common practice in Indian art, with none of the European obsession with originality. I mentioned that Roxburgh had 2 sets of drawings made of the Roxburgh Icones, and when studying collections of Indian natural history drawings, one frequently comes across versions of the same drawing made for different patrons. In 1831, Lady Dalhousie, who was wife of the Commander-in-Chief of the Indian Army, mother of the Marquis, visited Simla, where she collected plants and also employed a local artist. She visited Dr. and Mrs. Govan and had copies made of some of their drawings. In this case, the Dalhousie drawing of the voodoo lily, with its more natural spotting on the right of the leaf stalk, appears to be the one drawn from life, with the governed version with the very stylized spots on the leaf stalk on the left being the copy. But both of them have ended up at Kew by different routes. The Dalhousie ones were given by her to William Hooker, and as we've seen, the governed ones were given by her sons. Earlier we saw that picture of the very desiccated Prangos, but here it is in its full glory, painted for Hugh Falconer by an unknown artist in virtuosic detail around 1840. So moving on to the last gallery, the fourth one, which was the walls were painted in a rich red and devoted to the a geographical area between Saharanpur and Calcutta, the provinces of Awadh, Bihar and Bengal, which the company gradually took over by force of arms and dodgy deals. These, of course, had catastrophic consequences for the indigenous population, as it proposed to extract obscene wealth from the area. The horrors included not only the Bengal famine, in which some 10 million people died, but the cynical employment of applied botany, forcing tenant farmers to grow crops such as indigo and opium. The historical hit back against such practices forms a major part of the Singh Twins exhibition, so Sita and I decided not to emphasise this aspect in ours, which concentrates on a hopefully more positive aspect of the colonial encounter, the taxonomic, evolutionary and biogeographical studies of plants. However, not least to avoid accusations of art washing, it was essential to include one drawing in which this darker history is encoded. There's no stunning image of indigo in the Kew collection, but there is one of the opium poppy, whose baleful influence haunts the world to this day. This drawing comes from the Freer collection, in which there are two very distinct elements in style, in terms of style and date. This is from the part made in the 1790s, which are uniquely stylized and painted on French paper. And while the drawings are all annotated by Freer, it's possible that he acquired an earlier collection, perhaps commissioned by a French patron, somewhere like Chandernagore. The company had monopoly over the growing and processing of opium in Bengal and Bihar, which it ruthlessly enforced, as recently exposed in clinical detail by Amitav Ghosh in his Smoke and Ashes. In Bihar, the company insisted on growing only the white-flowered form, whilst the latex of the red and purple-flowered varieties is in fact equally potent and was commonly grown around here in Western India, where the company didn't have control over cultivation. This drawing of an aquatic plant, Nymphoides indica, shows several stories of the sort that can be revealed through close study. I mentioned the Freer collection several times, but until my work at Kew, its commissioner was unknown. Despite the fact that the annotations are clearly in an 18th century hand, it had been known as the Hooker collection. I'd known it for many years because parts of it are in Edinburgh, but had despaired of ever finding out anything about it. But this drawing proves to be the key. It's the only one in a collection of 400 that bears a place name, Berhampur, which rang a bell, as it's where Freer, one of John Hope's star pupils in Edinburgh in the 1760s, had died in 1811. The dates fitted, and I then found that the very distinctive handwriting, bottom left, matched known Freer manuscripts. But there's also a botanical story here. Identifying and applying the correct modern names to the plants depicted was an important part of the project, but the fruiting stem curving down to the left-hand corner actually belongs to a different species to the main part. It's a Sagittaria. It does grow in the same ponds as the Nymphoides and has similar leaves, But when the artist wanted to add the fruit to the drawing of the flowers, he must have collected the wrong part. Fortunately, the Kew taxonomists failed to notice this, or they would have chopped it up. I mentioned earlier that it isn't always easy to say whether a drawing is by an Indian or a European artist, and it's very important to be honest about this. Works in the Claude Martin collection, made in Lucknow in the 1790s, are a case in point. While some of them in terms of layout and painting technique are clearly Indian, others like this beautiful hibiscus might easily be attributed to a European hand. One reason for thinking otherwise, but one can never be certain, is that Martin had several identical versions of each drawing made, probably intended as gifts to friends. It seems unlikely that a European artist would have been willing or even capable of making such accurate facsimiles, whereas for an Indian artist it would have been standard practice. One of the aspects of the drawings that I've always been keen to stress is that the work commissioned by East India Company employees doesn't represent a single school. In India, the surgeons could find artists wherever they went, with many different backgrounds, from courtly painters in the north to more vernacular traditions in the south. Company school, or company kalam, as originally used in India, and by Mildred Archer in her early work, referred strictly to the Patna school of painters, though more recently it's come to be much more widely applied. But these two images of Rumex v. Sicarius were made within a few hundred miles of each other in Bengal or Bihar within a single decade, and serve to show the sheer diversity of styles, from the very European-looking one on the left of Claude Martin's painter to something altogether stranger from Frere's early collection. But the last drawing I'll show is one of my favourites, whilst most bizarre. It's also from the early part of the Frere collection, and another depiction of the Singara nut that we saw earlier in the Roxburgh version. But this one's unique in the cross-hatching which is used to show its watery habitat, and the almost sci-fi stylisation of the plant with its spiky fruits is equally unique, if anything resembling a 16th century woodcut. As I said at the beginning of the talk, the exhibition opened to the public on the 11th of October. In its publicity, Kew makes it clear that the Singh twins is the main event. And on arrival at Kew for the opening, I was rather taken aback to find this graphically expressed on the facade of the gallery. No image of one of Kew's own stunning drawings, only a Singh twins image, to which the Flora Indica exhibition is billed in smaller font as merely alongside. Advertisements on the London Underground on the right also make no mention of the Flora Indica exhibition, and risk assumptions on the part of Russian commuters that the exhibition represents the apotheosis of the Empress of India, which is as far from the twins' intention as it's possible to imagine. This also shows a very strange lack of confidence on Kew's part as to the importance and interest to the public of its own peerless collection. But comments in the exhibition visitors book suggest that this might need to be revised. But despite the hitches, the exhibition looks great and hopefully conveys at least a taste of the sense of excitement and achievement that Sita and I have had in revealing long hidden stories, re-establishing lost links between parts of the collection, and above all, in being able to put artist's name to many of the drawings and presenting it to the public. As for the exhibition's legacy, one aspect is the book that's available here, for which the Kew Publication Department did an excellent job in choosing a brilliant designer in Ockie Murray. And Rowley have done an equally wonderful job in printing an Indian edition, which has just come out. This is the first launch of it, in fact. More importantly, given that the interest of the exhibition in India, already apparent from social media, are the plans to bring it to India in facsimile form, hopefully to Mumbai, Kolkata, Hyderabad and Bangalore, and Sita is currently making plans for this. But in the meantime, I hope that some of you, if you're in London, will be able to see the exhibition, which, as I've said, is on till April. And if you can't go there, then you can see it all reproduced in the book. Thanks very much indeed.